factors. So the first of these factors is usually known as ignorance. Ignorance means not understanding reality as it actually is. It's a kind of distortion of our understanding, not seeing things clearly. And once there is ignorance in a being, whether it's a human being or any other being, once that is there is the making of karma. We create karma through our actions, and that karma, of course, leads to results in the future which are either pleasant or unpleasant, depending on that karma. That's the second factor. And the results that it gives in the future are very often connected with rebirth, in other words, where we get born in the future life. So the third factor of dependent origination is consciousness. It's consciousness arising in a particular state. And with consciousness, you always have a body, you always have the mind, the other factors of the mind are always there with consciousness. So because of that, that becomes the fourth factor of dependent origination. It's mind together with body being conditioned by consciousness. The fifth factor, once you have mind and body, you have the six senses. The six senses are part and parcel of this thing we call the human being, mind and body. And once you have the six senses, you start to experience the world. The experiencing of the world happens through these six senses. So that is the sixth factor, known as contact usually. It's like we are contacting the world, we are experiencing the world. Now an important part of that experience, a very fundamental part of it, is called feeling. This becomes the seventh factor of dependent origination. We experience the world usually either as something pleasant or as something unpleasant. And this can change very rapidly from moment to moment. One moment we have something pleasant that we experience, the next moment something unpleasant, and the moment after that something which is somewhere in between maybe. Then when we experience, because we experience things as pleasant and unpleasant, we have desires. We have desires because we want the pleasant states to last, we want to have those most of all, and we want the unpleasant things to disappear. We have a kind of aversion or negativity to the unpleasant things. So desire is a natural consequence of feeling. Once you have this desire or craving, which is the eighth factor, then you have this thing called, which is called taking up or grasping or clinging sometimes. And this very often is like once you have desire, it's like you have strategies, you have ways to make sure that those desires get fulfilled in the best possible way. And these strategies, these are called taking up, clinging, grasping at things. Once we grasp at things, once we decide on a particular way of living our life, then again we make karma according to that grasping, according to that clinging. And once we make karma, once we live in that particular way, this is called existence. Factor number 9, factor number 10, I think it is. Then we have rebirth or jati as the 11th factor, because we get reborn according to that karma that we make. Once we get reborn, then we experience what everybody else in human life experiences. We experience aging, we experience death, and we experience all the sufferings of being a being, whether it's human, animal, or otherwise. So that in brief is what dependent origination means. It's a sequence of conditions, the sequence of 12 factors, each one building on the previous one. And the important thing here is to understand that there is a conditional relationship between all of these factors. And that's why it's called the dependent origination. The subsequent factor depends on the previous one. So for example, to experience suffering, experience old age and death, first of all you have to be born. Birth is a necessary condition for you to be able to experience suffering in life. So each one of these conditions, starting from ignorance at the very beginning, all the way to suffering at the very end. Each one is necessary for the subsequent one to exist. That is a very important fact in this dependent origination. That's the only thing you really need to keep in mind for this talk, because then the rest of the things should hopefully fall in place. Each condition is necessary for the subsequent one to exist. This is a causal relationship between these 12 links. So, to get a grasp, get a feeling for what dependent origination is all about, I often, sometimes tell people that the best thing to do is to look at the end points of these 12 links. The end points are, first of all, ignorance at the very beginning, or misunderstanding of reality, if you like, and then suffering at the very end. These are the two end points, the first and the 12th factor of dependent origination. Because if we understand the end points, everything else becomes quite clear, because it is a conditioned sequence. So the last factor of dependent origination then is suffering. Now this is obviously very important, because this shows us the purpose of dependent origination. The purpose is found in the last factor. So the purpose is to show us basically why suffering comes about in the world. This is why we have this teaching of dependent origination, because it shows us the causal arising of suffering. This is the purpose, and that's why this is the last factor of this thing here. And of course this becomes straight away very practical. You can see straight away why this is very practical, because if we understand why suffering arises in the world, then we have an opportunity to do something about it. If we understand the causal relationship, then we can do something with those causes, and we can both alleviate the suffering, lessen the problems that we have, and ultimately overcome, perhaps even overcome that suffering altogether. So this is why dependent origination is so interesting, because it shows us how suffering comes to arise in the world. And the interesting thing here is that the immediately previous condition before suffering, independent origination, is rebirth. It is birth which is the condition for suffering. So if we don't get born, basically we're not going to suffer. It is the very fact that we do get born into the world which gives rise to all these problems. And, of course, these two last factors, birth and then suffering. Suffering is sometimes also called aging and death, because these are the two most prominent and two most important factors of suffering. You will see that birth and death, these are also what is often a shorthand for this thing we know as samsara. Samsara is this perpetual wandering on, round and round, from one life to another one, from birth to death, from birth to death. So the last two factors here of dependent origination essentially are equivalent to this samsara, this eternal, perhaps not eternal, but certainly this very long-lasting wandering on from one life to another one, again and again and again. So this is another way of looking at dependent origination. It shows us how this thing we know as samsara comes to arise in the world, how there can be such a thing as samsara. Very briefly, samsara, the best way to look at samsara is not to look at it as kind of the universe out there, something different from us. Samsara is essentially how we as human beings experience the world. So it is your internal, what goes on inside your head, that is samsara. How do you experience the world? So all the going around, if you could recollect your past lives, all the being reborn, all the getting old, all the dying, all the suffering, all the happiness, everything you do, all your experiences, this is essentially what samsara is all about. And samsara is of course ultimately equivalent again to suffering, because all this wandering around, all this birth, dying, aging, doing this, doing that, again and again and again, life after life, now being born here, now being born there, all that is essentially suffering according to the Buddha's teachings. So, in other words, what I'm saying is that dependent origination, it shows us how samsara and how suffering comes to be. It's extremely useful to know this, because then we can actually do something about it. In the future are very often connected with rebirth, in other words, where we get born in the future life. So the third factor of dependent origination is consciousness. It's consciousness arising in a particular state. And with consciousness, you always have a body. So the first of these factors is usually known as ignorance. Ignorance means not understanding. You always have the mind, the other factors of the mind are always there with consciousness. So because of that, that becomes the fourth factor of dependent origination. It's mind together with body being conditioned by consciousness. The fifth factor, once you have mind, there is the making of karma. We create karma through our actions, and that karma, of course, leads to results in the future which are either pleasant or unpleasant, depending on that karma. That's the second factor. And the results that it gives in reality as it actually is, it's a kind of distortion of our understanding, not seeing things clearly here. And once there is ignorance in a being, whether it's a human being or any other being, once that is there,